Does everyone benefit or only the wealthy? That's one of the questions about today's Stephen Harper announcement on income splitting. That's plus the campaign-style look and sound of it all, like this.
Friends, under the plan we have announced today, every single Canadian family with children will benefit. Everyone will have more money in their pockets.
Andrew is in Vancouver tonight, Chantel is in Montreal, Bruce is in Ottawa. So there we had it. Glasses off, contacts in, no tie, the family and the crowd as props around him, and billions of dollars on the table. I guess we're really into the campaign now. Andrew.
No kidding. I sort of thought maybe the Tories should have paid the networks for the time they were taking. That looked a lot like an infomercial. It's unfortunate that yet again we're having major policy announcements being made on the fly outward somewhere in the country rather than in Parliament where they ought to be made. But definitely this was a campaign in full mode and a full suite of different policy instruments all aimed at the same sweet spot of trying to convince families with children that the Tories are on their side.
Chantel, does it really matter where the announcement's made? I mean, I understand the argument of a Parliament economic statement, et cetera, but at the end of the day, does it really matter?
Well, it says something about what Parliament has come to represent. In the old days, if you were the Prime Minister, you would want to make the announcement in Parliament because it gave you gravitas. You were the person in power. You could deliver. The others were stuck on stages in community halls with families. I think at this point the Conservatives have decided that money talks and they don't need the stage of the House of Commons. They can just send you a check at the proper time just before the election to remind you of those promises and their power to implement them.
Yeah, those checks due probably the first one starting next summer. Bruce, where are you on this?
Well, I think, Peter, that this is another situation where the government has recognized that if they hold back all of the measures that they want to undertake until they're in an actual election campaign, that 37-day thing that we call an election campaign, then people look at those things as just promises that might or might not come true, and they compare them against what other people would do. And so if you start rolling them out, as soon as you find extra quarters under the sofa cushions, and there seems to be a lot of quarters being found under the sofa cushions, they actually become policies, and then the other parties are challenged to either say, I would go along with that, I would continue it, or I would do something else. And so I think the Conservatives are doing something relatively clever from a political positioning standpoint, and certainly by talking about tax cuts as much as they are, they're cementing the notion that if you like tax cuts, they're the brand for you. All
right, let's talk about the substance in terms of income splitting, because it wasn't that long ago that the late Jim Flaherty, shortly after he'd resigned from his position as Minister of Finance, made it pretty clear that he was not a proponent of the income splitting promise for reasons of the impact it might have on the deficit. Let's have a reminder. He said this in an interview with Amanda Lang. Watch this.
I think income splitting needs a long, hard, analytical look to see who it affects in the society and to what degree.
So I can remember we all talked about that at the time and the impact it could have. I know this is slightly different than the original promise, what was announced today, but does the Flaherty statement about income splitting come into play in terms of the next year and the way the people are going to campaign for and against what the government announced, Andrew?
Well, the critique that's made sometimes that this is disproportionately benefits people in upper income, it may be a political critique, it's less of a policy critique. This is supposed to achieve equity between different families with the same level of income, so we're treating like as like. It's a matter of tax fairness. So the Tories certainly need to make sure that they get that message out there. They've tried to cover this off by limiting it in terms of the amount you can actually claim. In other words, to reduce the benefit going to upper income families, which is probably smart politically in terms of heading off that, but remove some of the coherence from the policy in terms of treating people with equal incomes in the same way, not discriminating against families that have one income versus families with two incomes.
Bruce?
I don't think that the Flaherty comment will matter very much, Peter. I mean, first of all, I don't think the opposition parties are going to campaign saying we want the version of this tax cut that Jim Flaherty would have wanted. So I don't think he's going to come up that often in this conversation. But I also think the Conservatives took the measure of some of the criticisms that were being leveled at this policy and adjusted their announcement today, both in terms of the specific capping that Andrew talked about, but also the other measures that they introduced to help families. And so I think they will have taken some of the the risk out of the situation for themselves. It remains to be seen whether tax cutting ever delivers rewards at election time. I think it often looks from a distance as though it might, but sometimes taxpayers just don't think about it that way.
Chantal?
I think if the Conservatives could have walked away from this promise, a number of them would have, but they could not, because it had taken an iconic nature. This was the big promise of the last election, so they had to deliver something. I suspect that electorally they expect more bang for the bucks from the raise in the child benefit and the monthly payment, especially since everybody that benefits from this increase is going to get a bigger check in July, because they're going to be getting the first 6 months of the year just in time for a fall campaign. So I think that's how they tried to mitigate the criticism that there aren't going to be any people with kids who can say, I got nothing from this government.
How offside does the opposition, what kind of position does it put them in? We're talking billions of dollars here. They're making promises themselves. What's the easiest way for them to handle this?
They've already on the record as saying that they're going to roll back the income splitting, for example. And I think people talk about the political cleverness of that, of putting it out there so the opposition parties have to say we would roll it back and substitute our own programs. But frankly, I also think that's good for democracy. What you're seeing here are choices. This is the Conservatives' choice. The opposition are going to make their choice. But there's a trade-off. You don't get both. You get one or the other. What I would say just one more time, though, is on the parliamentary thing. It's not just about gravitas and the symbolism of unveiling a policy like this in Parliament. It's also that you're present and to be accounted for and having to answer questions from your political opposition in a very direct way. And by taking it off onto this infomercial, you're robbing that ability and that role that Parliament is supposed to play.
But at the same time, the NDP did their childcare announcement a couple of weeks ago, and it was the same kind of thing. Or it was an infomercial, and they're not the government, but they were doing it with all the props around Tom McCarran.
That's right. Everybody's doing it, but I think the government, whatever its party is in power, has a particular responsibility to be accountable to the people that are there to hold them accountable.
All right. Well, let me move it on. I want to bring in something that happened in Manitoba this week, kind of an open revolt going on by some of the senior cabinet ministers in Greg Selinger's government. The government there has had a rough time because of the introduction of a sales tax that I think it suggested would never happen, and it did, and they've plummeted in the polls. So there's kind of a caucus or cabinet revolt going on. Here's the way he bought Greg Selinger, the premier, at least some time. Watch this.
My decision today is to continue to serve Manitobans. That's what I was elected to do, and I'm passionately committed to that.
All right, what I found interesting is not necessarily the Manitoba situation in isolation, but the overall impact of these kind of cabinet revolts. We saw the same kind of thing happen in Alberta, cost the premier her job. We saw it in Newfoundland, cost the premier her job. In a way, we saw it in BC a couple of years ago with Premier Campbell. But are we seeing, caucus revolts, cabinet revolts aren't new, but are we seeing some new way of trying to adjust the balance within the situation of an unhappy government in terms of its numbers and concerned about its leadership? Bruce, you want to start us?
Well, I don't know if we can say that there's a pattern developing like that. I think this is a situation, another situation of a game of chicken gone badly, that normally what should happen when these tensions build up within a government is that people have quiet, private conversations, and that one perspective, the dissenting cabinet ministers in this case, would say to the premier, if you don't step down, if you don't lay out a plan to leave, we're going to have to go public. And the premier, sensing that situation, has a couple of different choices. He can respond with some kind of pressure that makes them not want to go public, or he can accede to their pressure. This didn't happen in that case. It hasn't happened in other cases. But I think parties would be wise to look at these situations and say, what's happening there is untenable. It's not going to work out very well, I wouldn't think, for the premier. It's terrible for the image of these parties as organized, disciplined entities that should have the reins of government.
Chantal?
I think that you have to go back to Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin's, I think, successful ouster of Paul Martin, of Jean Chrétien, although it took whatever time Mr. Chrétien set on it. And you see a pattern of more and more of it happening. But I think more importantly, yes, parties should probably think that this is not a good way to deal with a leader, especially a sitting premier or prime minister. But in the reverse, by concentrating power around their person, with a palace guard that is more influential than the cabinet and the ministers, leaders court those revolts. They leave very little other options to ministers who are reduced, from what I see today, to the influence that MPs used to have under Brian Mulroney. And so I'm not surprised that it's spreading, and I think that it will continue until there's more collegiality kicked back into the system.
Andrew?
I think we have to look at what's driving this, which is that the NDP is 10 or 15 points back in the polls, and they're back in the polls, and they're in trouble because they reneged on a major election promise. They said they were not going to raise the provincial sales tax without a referendum, which is what the law required. McGuinty in Ontario, remember, did exactly the same thing and got away with it. But what's happening recently is the public has gotten fed up with this, and government after government has run into trouble by trying to do this old game of reneging on major campaign promises. So that's the first point, is they're being held to account for this. I think, though, when you see these very messy, uncertain, drawn-out, damaging processes that we're seeing in Manitoba, that we saw with Chrétien Martin, we've seen elsewhere, it kind of makes the point that Michael Chong was trying to make with his Reform Act, which is, let's have some rules around this. Let's have some regularity so people know what the ground rules are. They know, for example, what threshold you're required to remove a leader. Because what happens now is nobody knows, and so everybody kind of keeps guessing, keeps pushing back and forth. You have this intolerable situation now in Manitoba, not just with the caucus revolting, but particularly 5 cabinet ministers, where the premier says he's not going, the cabinet ministers say they're not going, and supposedly everybody's supposed to be okay with that. That is not on. You cannot have that kind of breach of cabinet solidarity and have any kind of accountability, to the legislature, where one side of the government can say, don't blame us for that policy, that was that other government that did it.
Yeah, well, we'll see how much time, if any, has been bought for peace as a result of the events of this week. I want to close tonight by running what I think is kind of the political clip of the last couple of days, and with all due respect to Canadian politicians, it's not one of them. It's Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey in the United States, who got heckled at a speech yesterday, and I'm running it for a number of reasons. It's a great clip, but also we're into election season now, even if it's going to take another year before the election is in Canada, and heckling could well become a part of the scene that we watch unfold. Watch this, and it was yesterday in New Jersey. Watch this.
You all know me, so if we're going to get into a debate here today, it's going to get very interesting and very fun. So, yeah, I understand. So I'll be more than happy to have a debate with you anytime you like, Guy, because somebody like you who doesn't know a damn thing about what you're talking about except to stand up and show off when the cameras are here. I've been here when the cameras aren't here, buddy. Turn around, get your 15 minutes of fame, and then maybe take your jacket off, roll up your sleeves, and do something for the people of this state. But until that time, sit down and shut up.
Nobody has ever accused him of being shy. I can't think of a Canadian parallel to that. I've seen some good put-downs from the stage to hecklers. But does that kind of response work? What do you think, Bruce?
No, it doesn't work. That having been said, I'm pretty sure I know a number of politicians who've had days when they wanted to do exactly what Governor Christie did in that clip. But it doesn't work because, well, for any number of reasons, not the least of which is it's kind of over-the-top, aggressive. It's much better for there to be these folks to be in situations where people can escort hecklers, can deal with them quickly, and move on. It can become a problem on the campaign trail, but it hasn't become that big a problem. And certainly, I would never have advised anybody to deal with it that way.
All right, you get the quick last word, Chantal.
I think the trend here is to keep hecklers out, as we saw in the last campaign with the Conservatives, and after last week's events on Parliament Hill, the inclination to keep people out will be stronger in the upcoming campaign.
Well, if you can do it in 10 seconds, Andrew, you get one too.
I think actually in this case it works for Christie. This is part of his persona, it's part of his brand. It wouldn't work for a lot of people. I think it works for him.
All right, that's good. Listen, thank you all. Enjoy Vancouver, Andrew. Chantal's in Montreal. Bruce is in Ottawa.